Good morning. Good morning. How is everyone on this happy Friday? And I wanted to talk with you about Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Now, this is actually Women's History Month, and I did my research on this, and I wrote this paper last June. Okay, so let's get into talking about the history of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, known as Fanny the Abolitionist. She fought for civil rights. She spent her life fighting for civil rights, women's rights, men's rights for all humankind, lecturing across American states. And during her established presence at the lecturing, she was successful in New England, New York, by strategizing, because what she would do is she would send advertisement before her scheduled lectures, okay, so she could get exposure. Her advertisements were expanded as far as Cleveland, Cincinnati, and she worked extensively in the District of Columbia. So if any of you have done your history or studied for Fanny the Abolitionist, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, then you would know something about her. And she also delivered messages on realities and hopes of Reconstruction under titles such as The Nation's Great Opportunity. And I wonder today if we would take the time to step back and to study the politicians before we vote for them to see if they're concerned about the nation's great opportunity and what we can do to better our nation with the opportunities that are out there, because they should be opportunities for everyone that wants to receive them, not just for some, but the opportunity should be out there for all of us. She wrote on the lessons of the hour and home influence. And what can we teach someone in 1 hour? What can we teach them in 1 hour that they have a takeaway that they can take it with them and use it? And then the home influence. How are you influencing the people in your home? How are you influencing the people in your home? So Mrs. Harper's arguments were built on understanding how both race and gender biases grew from the same evil root of how black women been fighting for generations against institutional evil, and their struggles offer a template for our American future. Okay, she was deeply vested in addressing the social political challenges, performed the common rough work, and we got to keep doing the common rough work, even if it may not be easy, but we still got to do the common rough work. And then the essential labor of the heart of black women's self-advocacy and political agency, all during the 19th century. We cannot give up. We got to keep moving forward. And though there is a link between Mrs. Harper fighting for women and men rights in the 19th century to the women activists pressing for social change in the 21st century, who still recognize the limitations and possibilities of the black American citizen. And we still have limitations, and they still place hindrance and barriers in front of possibilities that we're all supposed to have, and we have limitations when we're trying to pursue better lifestyles and better opportunities for ourselves. And I agree. I argue, that Mrs. Harper should be studied because of the work she performed. It was significant, and it remained instructive with the economic divide that limited black people access to the public and private sector. And that still goes on today. Where black people are limited. Their access is limited to the public and private sector. And as soon as the black person gets to a point where they're able to purchase something, guess what happens? They start digging up things to incarcerate them. And look at what goes on today. Still incarcerating black men at a higher rate, especially the ones with money that have arrived to be able to buy things. They limit them. And how they limit their access is by bringing up false charges in the judicial system. And you have corrupt prosecutors that will sit here and they will use laws that have been repealed. They will misuse and abuse laws that have no evidence, and they will suppress evidence. They will do everything they can to incarcerate the black successful man that have been able to move past the limitations and the barriers and use their opportunities to get farther ahead to help the black community. And guess what they do? You see it. I don't have to name names, but you see it over and over and over again, how they do things. And so she was fighting for these rights That's the history of it. And then her bio, she was born into the slave state of Baltimore, Maryland. And if you think about it, there are some people from Baltimore, Maryland that are participating and have participated in the downfall of another black man. That's what they do. We wonder where they learned it from. But anytime you are a black person and you are working to destroy and bring down another black person, I'm afraid you haven't done your history. You haven't suffered enough, or you don't know enough to know that what you're doing is wrong. And any time a black person uses another black person, they come together to destroy black men, another black man, there is something to be said about it. But we wonder, where did they learn that from? We can really say where they learned it from, right? Most of us know where they learned these bad behaviors from. But she was born on September 24th, 1928, and she died on February 22nd, 1911. She was the only child of free parents. She was born to free parents. Their names are unknown, but they died in 1828, and she was left a young orphan at the age of 3. So she was raised by her maternal aunt and uncle, Henrietta and Reverend William Watkins. So she met Harper, Fenton Harper, and he was into politics. She met him, and on November 22nd, 1886, in Cincinnati, Ohio, who was a widower. So he was already a widower, where his first wife, or late wife, had passed away, and he had 3 young children. And so the couple, they married, they settled on a farm outside Columbus with land purchased with her earnings. Because see, she worked, she taught in the schools, she had a good upbringing, she had a good education. So she taught in the schools, and she saved her money. And this is according to land records, that she saved her money, because it was her earnings that she had made. So Mrs. Harper's husband wanted to maintain family ties with his brother that traveled to Zanesville, and it was a city outside Columbus, and there were city potential opportunities. So soon a daughter was born to that union, whom they named Mary. She was born in 1862. Now, the war had not quite ended when Mr. Fenton Harper passed away on May 23rd, 1864. And this was prior to Mr. Harper's death. Miss Harper, she would go around, she only lectured like once or twice during that time. But she built a home business of making and selling butter. Now, that was very profitable back then, of making and selling butter. And you see all types of brands of butter in the grocery stores, right? But that was a very profitable business. But after her husband died, she soon learned, when the administrators of Mr. Fenton's administrators of his estate came, guess what they did? Because he was deeply in debt. So they seized not just his possessions, but all of hers, which was a chief means of her support to pay his debts. So she was left with nothing to pay his debts. So the things that she had, and the tools and supplies and the equipment to make butter, it was very expensive. So there was no way, without profit or money coming in, to be able to repurchase those things to keep her business going. And so let me tell you something. What they did was wrong. It was illegal. And they've always done things to hurt black people and to take away from black people, and violate laws and rights, like they still do. And so the land, the paperwork, it didn't have his name on it at all. But it was taken also, her land, and it was auctioned off. Her land was. And it took more than a year to receive $100 funds that were allocated to her and her daughter. On August 20th, 1864, they did this to her. So it's sad. And if there's a family in Orange County out in California, they fought to get their land back, and they won. So if you read their story, if that's any encouragement to you, if you have had land taken from you that was not taken, it was unrightfully taken, fight for your land to get your land back. And so she did. She had to return to activism. after she was left with no funds to support her stepchildren and her biological daughter. So she originally took her stepchildren to other family members, boarded them, took them to live with other family members, but she kept her daughter with her. And then she had to place her stepchildren with their maternal grandmother while she kept Mary with her. But once once Ohio declared the land separate property, which she had to pay almost twice to get back. Now, this is property that they took from her illegally, but she had to pay almost twice to get it back because, back then they figured blacks didn't have rights. They were, treated inhuman. So they didn't have rights. So they took the land that belonged to her that did not have her deceased late husband's name on it. She had to pay almost twice to get her property back from a wealthy farmer that purchased her property at an auction. But let me tell you something. She held on to those titles of the land once she got her land back until her daughter's death. And then she sold both of the parcels. Now, historically, she wrote some poems. She wrote 3 poems as essays and 2 poems in the Christian Recorder, a poem in Pine and Palm, a poem in the National and Anti-Slavery Standard, and a poem in the Anti-Slavery Rule and reprinted by the Liberator. The last poem was to the Cleveland Union Savers, and then the Weekly Anglo-African on September 22nd, 1862, reordered essay on the war and president's colonization scheme. Wow. And her lesser known on October 10th, 1863, during her marriage. Now, Mrs. Harper also became actively involved in moral issues and social reforms while building a cooperative relationship. This is what we got to continue to do. A cooperative relationship. Being cooperative with one another and commitment to improving conditions in the black community. You got to build in the black community if you want the black community to come up. You got to build cooperative relationships. You got to come together, not stand apart. You got to bridge the gap and build bridges, not destroy bridges and tear them down, man. You have got to come together and build cooperative relationship and be committed to improving conditions in the black community. You got to ask yourself, when you're saying that they need to do X, Y, and Z, what are you doing to build cooperative relationships and improving conditions in the black community? Thus, she chose titles as the mission of the war, the causes and effects of the war, Reconstruction. And this is very important. The colored man's future relation to the government. And you see that the colored man's future is broken when it comes to in relation to the government. They have broken and kept the relationship. Matter of fact, they've never built a relationship with the black man. And the ones they have, they find a way to break that relationship when they feel that the black man is getting too high and too far. When they feel that the black man has overstepped their boundaries, they find every kind of way to bring charges against them and to charge them, find them guilty, and incarcerate them at higher numbers by a prop jury or a jury that doesn't understand the laws, and they lie to the jury and they misuse and abuse and misinterpret the laws on purpose, because the colored man's future relation to the government has never been where it needs to be. It is a broken relationship. It's one that's never been established with trust. It's never been established with humanity to treat the black man like a real human being, but they constantly will do what they can to assault the black man and keep them down. So if you have young sons, you're raising young boys, guess what? You ought to be concerned about your son's future relation to the government, the future relationship to the government, because we see today that it still goes on what they're doing to get rid of even our young boys. And now you have black on black crime that are killing their young boys and young people at an enormous alarm rate. We got to do our history. This critical race theory, because they don't want to teach it in the schools, we need to tell the truth. And we need to stand up and fight for the truth and fight that it needs to be taught so our young people will understand and know so that they can get the baton, learn and get the baton to pass it to the next generation. And we as the older people need to put this information out here because this is what she stood for. And see, let me tell you, Miss Harper shared podiums with public figures. She has notable contributions. She shared figures with Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips, Susan B. Anthony, as well as Henry Blackwell, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all who represented race and gender that constituted New York's newest citizens while lecturing about voting rights for black men before the women's suffrage. This was before the women's suffrage and the 15th Amendment that was advertised on a colorful pamphlet. Now you look up the 15th Amendment. That's your homework. Look it up. And if you don't know it, and Mrs. Harper was a poet and wrote anti-slavery poems who wrote a notable novel, Iola Leroy, 1892. Now her impact at the election was similarly massive with a major voice on abolition, civil rights, women's rights, and temperance. She gave hundreds of lectures on locations from Maine to Florida to Kansas to address legislators and party conventions in at least 50 states. Ms. Harper traveled almost 200 miles to Indianapolis to lecture twice on the mission of the war, spoke on the deadly gangrene rebellion, and racism has taken a deep and fatal hold on the nation. Racism. She further spoke to the Massachusetts 54th and African Americans bravely leading the assault on rebel troops at Fort Wagner with heavy casualties for military which refused them respect and equal pay to what white soldiers received. We know the story. You go and you apply for a job and you're making less. You know the story. And the argument is Mrs. Harper worked for self-determination? She had self-determination. She kept it going. Let me tell you something. In a time like that, political autonomy, racial equality, gender parity, and economic parity, and champion for a more democratic society for equal rights to the marginalized and disenfranchised who were disproportionately black female. We see it today. We see it today, people. And Mrs. Harper's work was significant, instructive with economic divides that resemble which are not too distant past of white supremacy and the belief in black inferiority, limited black people access, and other marginalized group identities had to the public and private sector, which education, the labor market, healthcare, and social services that represented the milk and honey of the nation. And let me tell you something. There are still disparities in the healthcare system for black Americans, people. Wake up. Even with women that are pregnant, they don't get the healthcare that they need when it comes to, healthcare, OBGYN for black women. And if we did the stats, we'll see even more statistics of alarming rate of black babies being born or dying because they're not, and even the women, the mothers that are carrying the child, dying because they're not getting the health care that they need. They're not being treated the same. So there are disparities in health care and even still today, the labor market and the education system. We have got to continue to the work because even in the education system, if you look at the Ivy League colleges where black people were refused education, but even if you go back, way back, before we probably was even born, how they refused to allow black people into the education system and even into college so that they can get a good education. So you got to think about it. A lot. There's things that have changed, but there are still change. And let me say this. Even if you go to school and they want to take you out of the school, the child, because of their hair, because it's twisted, it's braided, or it's in a afro and it's too tall and it's a distraction. Who are they to tell us about our natural hair that we were born with? beautiful hair that God has blessed us with. It is the beauty of color that no one can never take away from us. And so if you allow people in your skin to tell you that you can't be beautiful in your own natural realm of yourself and identity, there's a problem right there. There's a problem right there. And when we look at all of the stuff, the labor market, think about it. When you're trying to move up and they put barriers in your way and they want to, again, incarcerate the black man that has the means to move up and to buy things that will help give jobs to other black people. Okay? And she argued against slavery and basic human rights, although sexism and racism still very prevalent today. They were prevalent then, they're prevalent today. The assassination of President Lincoln, the casualties of the Civil War, and the ongoing conflicts of the first years of Reconstruction, facing double discrimination and dealing with her own issues. She had her own issues, but she gave up herself. How many of you have given up yourself? How many of you know someone that has given up their self to continue to do the rough work? Because she was doing the rough work and facing discrimination herself and dealing with her own issues. But Mrs. Harper work was with multidimensional in the physical and psychological social settings to lecture and protest. Mirroring civil obedience, it reflects her work. She maintained her sense of worth and humanity. See, you don't have to give up your sense of work to get the work done. You don't have to give up your sense of work to be an example and do the work that has been called for you to do. You don't have to give up your sense of worth. And we see a lot of women giving up their sense of worth and not even valuing their worth or knowing their worth. You don't have to give that up. And humanity in a culture where her gender and race played a big part in her abolitionist work. See, Miss Harper history should be studied, and I argue that it still should be studied because of the significant contribution she made to society for women and men's rights. See, Mrs. Harper was not afraid to speak to the white audience during the Civil War era, before and afters. And if it's some white people that come on this channel, I'm not afraid to speak to you about what continues to go on in this society. And so furthermore, she fought for her land rights and did not allow her trials, tribulations, and losses to deter her from traveling from city to city and to states to make her presence known at the lecture. And see, let me tell you something. She had losses. She had losses when they took her land, when they took her butter, her business, the things that she used for her butter business. It was very profitable, and they took those things. They know that they took those things and she would not be able to make a living, but she had skills, so she had to go back into activism to do the work to provide for herself and her stepchildren of her late husband, Mr. Fenton Harper, and her biological daughter from that union, Mary. She had tribulations, she had trials. We all go through them and been through them, and it's not over. It's not over, these trials and tribulations and the limitations that they place on us and the opportunity. And they'll do everything they can to take from you. And if you've been on a job for years, they will hurt you and do everything they can while you still stand in the midst. This is how they do things. They know because they got to do something. So we'll hire them. They are qualified, but then they'll do everything they can to try to sabotage and destroy you. It's real true, people. I know a lot of people have been through that. So she spoke at a time that racism and sexism was prevalent and still is today. Today, women are still fighting for women's rights in the workplace, still fighting political and equality for pay. It is important to further the argument why Frances E. Watkins Harper should be studied in history, because the narrative and characteristics need to be changed that black men and women are civil. They are worthy of the fight for the cause, for the good of humanity, respectfulness, intelligence, and equality in society. Black men and women are worthy, civil, worthy of the fight. And you have got to be worthy of the fight for yourself, worthy of the fight for the good of humanity, respect, intelligence, and equality in this society. See, we can't look at ourselves and say we're not worthy. We have got to be worthy and believe in our worth. And keep fighting. Don't give up. And furthermore, Miss Harper She persevered in the struggle for freedom. Her life work, with beliefs her life work would lead to the full liberation of Black women and men throughout the nation. See, the fight needs to continue because many Black men or women are killed without provocation, unprovoked, without legal consequences in the form of indictments and convictions. People need our go and say more. We see it still today. And we see men coming out of prison being vindicated and released after years and they were innocent to begin with. As new generations come up after us, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of age. Matthew 28:20. Mrs. Harper lectures and speeches give insight to help the new generation reimagine a more exclusive brand of democracy in the United States by advocating for the rights of Black people and safeguarding their lives. See, it can't just be about I'm trying to get a bag and I'm trying to bring down another successful Black man with lies and false allegations. You have got to do your research, young people, so you understand what's going on, and so you make the fight about what is right, not the fight about what is wrong. And see, there was an ongoing legacy. Mrs. Harper went as far to challenge the women in front of her to be real allies, to recognize and fight for both African American and women's rights, a quite different kind of reconstruction, one built on the premise of equality for all. Furthermore, she helped families escape slavery, fought for voting rights for all women, and for men to get land so everyone could vote. Men, go after your land. Invest in your land. And then Mrs. Harper's interest in unity and freedom for both men and women in the movement for broader freedom, knowledge, and human relatedness. Women as the companion of man must be a sharer. We must come together in cooperative relationship, not fighting amongst each other, not trying to take, but coming together as sharers. Man and woman, God created man and woman to work together, and the woman was the helpmate to Adam. Eve was the helpmate to Adam. And you don't have to believe in the Bible, but when you work together in heterosexual relations and come together as sharers. And as I spoke about the land, men get land so everyone can vote. That Orange County family that went after their land. So be inspired. Read up that story, look it up, and be inspired to get and take your land back that they stole from Miss Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, also known as Fanny the Abolitionist. And see, during the address to the 11th Women's Rights Convention, May 10th, 1886, gave a famous quote: "We all are bound together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the course in his own soul." See, there's going to be payback for these people that have done things wrong. Their karma is coming because the word of God, so you may be in the social realm, it's called karma with a K. But in the Bible, it says every man will reap what they sow it. I'm keeping it real, people. And so she was an influencer of faith. And I believe Mrs. Harper set an example and was led by faith, had to do with the reliance, endurance, discipline, self-worth, character, integrity she held and displayed throughout her life. See, let me tell you something about Miss Harper. She endured. We got to be able to endure. She had discipline. She knew her self-worth. She had character and integrity, and she displayed it throughout her life. And when she was at that lecture, she didn't have to disrespect anyone to get the truth out there. She didn't have to, devalue herself and to, she showed herself worthy. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of any witness, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others. 2 Timothy 2:2. Now, Mrs. Harper embraced the vision of Christianity, spoke on active Christians that helping to lead others to Christ in an everyday, practical way. So when Miss Harper became involved with the African Methodist Church, AME, and a lot of you know about the AME, my grandmother, rest in peace again, she was a member of the African Methodist Church. She was a pianist. She played the organ because she had a degree in music. Let me tell you, she went to school. My grandmother passed away, 92? She was on the mother's board. She carried herself in a dignified manner. And believe me, she got on us if we laughed in church. And she heard us. She had eyes in the back of her head. How many of you people know that your parents and grandparents had eyes in the back of their head? When you thought they didn't know and didn't hear you and wasn't watching, they got you after church. They corrected you after church. All they had to do was give you that look. But Frances Harper, she wrote Sowing and Reaping, a temperance story in 1876. Some scholars suggest she had in mind the letters of St. Paul to the Galatians. Furthermore, Mrs. Harper not only felt it was necessary to feed the body, but the soul should be fed with equal importance to humankind. She believed man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God, Matthew 4:4. Now, in the conclusion of my paper, Mrs. Harper aligned herself with entrepreneurial capitalism, which were values that her audience would share, and she spent her life battling those wrongs against slavery that was a national injustice during President Johnson era. Mrs. Harper went on to say, justice is not fulfilled so long as women is unequal before the law. Justice against any individual is a failure of democracy. When you have injustice against any individual, it's a failure of democracy. And thus accusing the white listeners of their refusal to recognize that class struggle is the root of black oppression. Hallelujah, somebody. Amen, somebody. And according to Francis Smith Foster, Harper advocated for a life in which the personal and public were merged to realize the moral, social, and economic development of society, which her literature was an essential tool to that end, must finally serve as her presentation of self. I argue that it should be Mrs. Harper should be studied in the schools. And because of the major contributions she made to society while selflessly working for a greater cause for humanity, for all, and never wavered in her fight for justice for all humankind, Miss Harper placed herself in a position to carry on her legacy by passing the baton to the next generation. And let me tell you something, not to take anything from her, because I value what I've done the research on, and man, I admire her so much. But there was a time, some time ago, before I even wrote this paper, passing the baton. And then we did a women's conference a few years ago at our church, and I came up with the title, and the people, they agreed, passing the baton. We have got to be able, as women, pass the baton to the next generation. And if we're not passing the baton, what are we doing? Just holding it in our hand, and we're just stuck with the baton in our hand? You can never get stuck with the baton in your hand, because the race that we run, we have got to be able to pass the baton to keep the race going. So you guys, I thank you for tuning in. And what I'm going to do is put, I'm going to put my references at the end of this video so that you will know where my research came from. And if you want to go and study and read up on the research that I've done, then you're more than welcome to do so. But again, please do not take my information and take it as your own, because it's not yours. I did the research, and I have to say that in the disclaimer, because sometimes people do that. But if you want to share the video, I am okay with you sharing the video, with you liking the video. And if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe to the channel. I don't come on every day, but I do come on. And I pray that each and every one of you will take something away from this message, this research, because it is less than an hour. And remember, what lesson can you learn or take away within an hour to take something back? So you young people, if you don't know your history, you have got to get involved and learn your history so that you will understand why we need to continue the fight of this woman, Fanny the Abolitionist, and get yourself in a position to carry on the legacy by passing the baton to the next generation. God bless you all. Peace out.